This is the French Tech APAC podcast. We are here still today at the site of the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society being held here in Singapore. The latest in our series of interviews just now. I'm Bill Poorman, one of the co-producers of the French Tech podcast. With me right now, Neha Thakkar. She is with the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society at INSEAD here in Singapore. And she just led a session here at the forum that was on gender diversity and the importance of gender diversity in the workplace and in society overall. First of all, welcome, Neha. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me over.
Absolutely. So the panel was more or less about tipping the balance. How do we get from the position that we're in now to a position where we have a more inclusive and diverse workplace? There were a variety of speakers. You moderated. Can you talk to me a little bit about what some of the takeaways were from the session today?
So one of the key highlights of this session was the fact that unconscious bias is just extremely prevalent. So even with the best of intentions, if people don't intend to be sexist, it's just so unconscious that you don't even know that you're probably being sexist. And that was definitely one of the thematics that manifested itself in many different ways. And the panelists were extremely senior leaders in their respective companies. And it was interesting to also hear about their experiences, about how they reached the places that they did and the kinds of challenges that they faced. The other highlight I'd say about the session was about speaking up, where it came up several times that, the only way we can actually tip the balance is if we are more vocal about our concerns and if we are more conscious even about our concerns. And lots of people end up making a lot of assumptions about, whether it's women who are considering motherhood or it's women progressing in their career. We need to stop making assumptions and be more vocal in asking the right questions, or for that matter, even expressing our concerns when we have any.
There were a couple of funny moments talking about the cultural expectations where people corrected themselves or others as they saw the wrong way people were expressing themselves. So,
indeed.
Yeah, so that was funny. We are the French Tech podcast. I'm wondering, can you speak to issues that are specific to the tech space that you've looked into or that you've heard about that really need addressed and how they could be addressed?
Sure. So two things that really pop in my mind as concerned specifically for tech is, number one, gender balance is good for all companies in general, largely because number one, it improves employee retention. Two, boosts morale. Three, bolsters innovation. Four, it contributes to the economy. And just fifth, an extension of that is it's just good for society in general. With tech specifically, given how much of the tech space is reliant on innovation, it just boggles my mind that companies are not being a little bit more conscious of ensuring that their teams are more diverse and inclusive. So there is, of course, a concern of then, tokenism creeping into companies, and we definitely don't want that. But yes, tech companies rely on innovation. So if you want to really be at the forefront of cutting edge technology and you want to be a company that's respected, you better have a diverse team. For sure you need the diverse team. So that's one aspect of tech that I'm concerned about, that companies are not doing enough, not yet. They're trying, but hopefully it'll happen in good time. The second thing that I'm really concerned about is specifically with AI. Because a lot of the machine learning relies on patterns that already exist, we are unconsciously teaching machines to follow the patterns of the unconscious bias that I just mentioned earlier. And that is, again, it's slightly easier to fix in the sense that, we will, of course, have to think about programming and corrections for that kind of machine learning. But if a machine is quote-unquote sexist, it's quite likely just copying human behavior, which shows up. So these are the two main concerns, I'd say, specifically with tech.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Specifically the tech, the workplace environment. But there's another element, too, something that actually French Tech Singapore and regionally is working on, which is getting women involved on the investment side. So there's this program that we have called Dare to be a Female Business Angel that gives women the training, understanding, like how to do due diligence, things like this, at all kinds of investment levels, to become the investors that make these products that create this technology. So kind of helps to address it maybe even before the company gets started. I don't know, what do you think about starting on the investment side even?
That's a very interesting point that you bring up, because I don't know the numbers, precise numbers off the top of my head, but I do remember coming across this research very recently about data that has reflected that women do not get enough investment into their ideas, but then when they do, they tend to outperform. Companies founded by women tend to outperform the ones founded by men. And I think there's at least a margin of about 10% better than male-dominated, co-founded companies. So yes, I mean, yeah, ideally we should probably even go a step further and ensure that women get the kind of support they need in being entrepreneurs in this space.
So the smart money would diversify.
Yes, of course, absolutely.
And you all want to be the smart money.
Indeed.
So,
if you want to make money, you need to really think about this, for sure.
Right. Oh, I want to turn to you in your work. So you are with the Hoffman Institute at INSEAD. So what are the programs that you have there?
So the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society is one of the newest institutes within INSEAD. We are at the forefront of ensuring that business is a force for good. So business as usual, not good enough. We want the leadership that we produce as a business school to be conscious of the social impact it has. And we're very closely aligned to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the idea is that we can attain those goals only if there's partnership between the public sector, private sector, and the academic world. And we are doing a lot of research in that space, very conscious of issues related to social impact generally speaking, but also more specific topics like gender balance, equity, sustainability, wealth inequality. So we're touching on a lot of these issues that we feel there's a sense of responsibility as a school, that the leadership that we produce is conscious and cognizant about the impact their businesses have when they go out there in the real world as graduates of INSEAD.
Interesting. Is there one specific program example or research project example that you can give, or is this something that's kind of suffused through the whole program?
Oh, it's across the school. It's across the alumni network. It's not very, in that sense, we want to make sure that our reach is as broad as possible. We have partnerships with governments, with the private sector. So it's not just, and the research as well is extremely diverse, touching on a lot of these topics that I already mentioned. And yes, the approach is to get all stakeholders involved. We can't just limit ourselves to just the school. We want to make sure, and also a massive element of the Hoffman Institute's work is walking the talk. We as a school want to be the example of a lot of these social impact issues in a positive way. So we want to make sure that we increase the number of women in our classrooms, the number of female professors that we have. That's just one example. But also in terms of sustainability, what is it that we're doing as a school in decreasing the usage of plastic, for instance? So it's a very holistic approach to being conscious about social impact.
Now, you've had an internationally varied career. You are from Singapore, originally from India, right? But from Singapore, and then have traveled and lived across the world, including the U.S. and Europe. On these issues of gender diversity and females being investors and workers and on boards, do you find differences between the Asia context and the Western context?
The challenges are the same, I'd say, but they just manifest in very different ways. So there's, of course, part of, you can take the evidence-based approach where you can look at the numbers itself. They're as depressing in Asia as they are in the US. So there's that. In many ways, say for instance, I remember when I had the pleasure of living in the US with Donald Trump as the president of the country, and I was like, wow, this is fascinating. The way he talks about women, I'm not sure a lot of Asian leaders talk about women that way. Or for that matter, on the other hand, the way, America, I thought, was very excited about having their first female president. Well, never happened. But then at the same time, I was like, hang on, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, all three of them have already done it. And they did it in the 70s. Like, what's going on?
Yes.
So I think it just manifests in a different way. And I'm again, it's not just about the US, even for that matter. Like in Switzerland, it's quite interesting. The way the conversation, the gender roles are quite strong in Swiss society as well. it's very common for colleagues in a workplace to ask you as a woman, say in the range of about 30 years or whatever, if you're in that age bracket, that, hey, aren't you thinking about settling down? You should have kids before, clock. What's going on with the clock?
They just asked you directly?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And there was another colleague of mine who had just returned from maternity leave, and she was questioned about, isn't it too early to leave your baby alone? And you've left your baby with the father of the child alone? Like, he's babysitting, quote unquote, babysitting the child?
Not the father, a babysitter.
Yeah. Indeed. So in many ways, I just thought that the challenges are similar, just manifested in very different ways. And I suppose there's something about the Asian culture that the gender roles feel far more evident than other cultures, but they exist everywhere. I have to say that's a bit depressing.
Well, right. This took a depressing turn. I'm not sure.
Ooh, can I just continue on the depressing tone, please?
Oh, sure. Why not?
I've got one more example, which will be very relevant for the French audience.
Yes, please.
So I was living in France when there was a whole debate about the burkini going on. And I get it, how, it is in a bit of a contrast, or in conflict rather, to the French values. But the fact that a society is fine with dictating what women can wear and they cannot wear, I found that super fascinating. And it was, on the depressing note.
Right. Well, and you've talked the U.S., you've talked Europe, you've talked Asia. There's a lot of work to do overall,
Indeed,
right, on
absolutely.
these issues, for sure. Kind of on that note, so you've talked about the United Nations a couple of times. You worked there, and now your initiatives are still connected to there. You've worked at the International Red Cross. You spent some time at Harvard. Those are all very elite institutions. I know that you've also worked on the ground with some Indian female entrepreneurs as well. So there's a big gap there between the elite and the on-the-ground institutions. Are there needs or gaps that are not being addressed, maybe disconnects between those two levels of addressing these issues?
I wouldn't say there are disconnects per se, in the sense that, because quite like, across the culture, I'd say even across the spectrum of the elite, quote unquote elite versus non-elite, the challenges are similar. So say, for example, one of the things that I think of off the top of my head with the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross, they had a lot of financial inclusion programs in post-conflict zones. And they specifically targeted giving women the money rather than men, because they realized that women in post-conflict zones are more likely to be responsible in the way that money is spent and actually generate money to look after their family.
Interesting.
And
through the Red Cross?
Yeah, this was the Red Cross, and some of the initiative, in Sri Lanka, for example, I remember I'd gone down to Sri Lanka for the work for Red Cross, and the success rate was phenomenal. So in that sense, I'd say a lot of these international organizations are very cognizant that, yes, we're in a little bubble of our own in some sense, but our work ultimately is at the grassroots in many ways. And in many ways, it's also about a philosophy that I very strongly believe in, and it's about thinking global but acting local. You want to think at a global level of equity, but then you want to contextualize it to the local reality. So in many ways, that's the positive note.
I was going to say.
To a positive note.
We're going to go with that positive note and conclude this. Neha Thakkar with the Hoffman Institute at INSEAD. Thank you very much for taking the time to be on the French Tech Podcast.
Once again, thank you so much for having me here.